The seasons of life are beautiful. As the leaves change and friends and family gather with tables overflowing with food, it's easy to feel grateful. But sometimes an uneasy feeling pops up like a weed, the feeling that there's never enough time, money, energy, or opportunity. But Jesus came to give us more than just enough. He came to offer an abundant life, not a life of riches or ease, but a life that allows us to rest and rise above the fear. Generosity flows from this truth. With faith and God's provision, we can live in abundance, sharing what we have freely, trusting that He will always give us what we need. Whether we have a little or a lot, we can flourish, loving God and others out of His abundance, because in Christ there is always enough. Just as a holiday meal or its beautiful centerpiece comes together piece by piece, we cultivate a lifestyle of generosity, one moment of humility and obedience at a time. Generosity isn't about one grand gesture. It's about the collection of small acts that come together, creating something beautiful. Together, with hearts filled with generosity, we can flourish.
Get well, hearing your voices almost brought me to the point of tears this morning, to where I was like, well, this is going to be embarrassing as we try to start this sermon. But your voices lifted up in this room is one of the most beautiful sounds that I get to hear. But then it makes me pause, because I know that that is only 1/100th of the sound that are singing praises to Him across the globe today. Or the start of last night, that'll extend into the morning. Or the ones that are the angelic beings that are singing praises to Him 24/7 that are surrounded the throne, but yet your voice is lifted up to the King. So I never want us to walk into this space, walk into this room, and not understand that it's a transcendent moment. It's a moment that 2 Peter would say the Spirit of God comes and dwells in believers when they come and gather together. He is here present with us. In the Old Testament, they would call that place the tabernacle. Now they would just call it the church. It's the gathering of the Spirit of God here. So when we walk into this space, it is not just walking into a room that has beautiful windows. It's not walking into a routine that we have of every week of singing, teaching, and singing and responding. But this is a moment of entering into the very presence of God. And if we're entering into the very presence of God, there is never a moment in which we enter into His presence in which we aren't expectant that He is going to do something. Expecting that He is going to speak to His people. We don't enter into His presence in the Old Testament when we see pictures of this and He remains silent. No, He speaks. And today He speaks. He will speak to us through His word, just like He has to Elisha, as we will look at, just like He will continue to do in the future through His word. And so I hope our posture this morning is one of going like, Lord, speak. Knowing that you and you and you and you and you may leave here with a different message that the Lord has placed in your heart, but yet it's a voice of the Lord based on Scripture that He has prompted within you. And so as we continue on in this series, we started a couple of weeks ago talking about the path to fulfillment and flourishing comes through trusting obedience to Jesus, a daily pursuit after Him. And we called this path 2 a couple of weeks ago. It's this idea that as we are following after Him every single day, we are having to trust in His call upon us on our life. We're having to be obedient to the things that He's calling us to do. And along that path too, Lindsay talked about last week, that there's going to be moments in which He calls us to do something that's so grand, so spectacular that we know we can't do it on our own. Whether that's sharing the gospel with somebody for the first time and you're going, I don't like to talk to anybody I don't know. And the Lord's going, no, I'm going to lead you in that. Whether it's over to something that would be as big as to founding some organization that would change the face of this issue. Whatever it may be, he's going to call us to something in our lives that's going to make us radically dependent upon him. And so as we're on this journey of flourishing and fulfillment and trusting obedience to Jesus, we also have to acknowledge that there's moments where our lives don't seem like they're flourishing. There's bumps in that road, on that path. There's a reason why Jesus would say this path that we're walking is a narrow path. It's because there's things that happen in our lives that cause us to go, what does flourishing actually mean, Lord? Because I feel like I'm doing these things and I'm leaning on you and I'm depending on you, but my life feels anything but flourishing at this very moment. And so today in 2 Kings chapter 4, we're going to look at the story and an account that takes place in the life of Elijah, in which there is someone who is lifted up here who is faithfully following after God, but yet they are hitting major bumps in their road in their pursuit of him. And it makes them go, what in the world is going on? And then how do we take that and then learn from it for our own lives? So in 2 Kings chapter 4, we have Elisha who takes over for the prophet of Elijah. So prophet that Lindsay talked about last week, his name was Elijah. He was the spokesperson for God, but yet his time of ministry has transitioned on to a guy named Elisha. And so Elisha takes over and he becomes the mouthpiece for God and his people. And he would take these journeys that would take him throughout the land of Israel as he's being trustingly obedient to the Lord in the things that he's called him to do. And what we get into today in chapter 4 of 2 Kings is we get one of these journeys. We get a glimpse into what happens, the way the Lord steps in and provides, and yet he is there even in the midst of tragedy. And so we're going to be reading a lot of passage this morning, okay? So if you have a Bible, follow along with us. If you don't, follow along on the screen as we walk through this story. So we're going to start first in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 8. We're going to read through verse 13 to get started this morning. So it was start in verse 8. It says, one day Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls, and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. And one day he came there, and he turned into the chamber, and he rested there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him. And he said to him, to Gehazi, say now to her, see, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? And she said, I dwell among my own people. All right, so let's pause there for a moment. So we have this story that begins. We have this woman from the village of Shunem, and she's evidently very wealthy. And what she does is she leverages that wealth to be able to further God's kingdom. So specifically, she goes, I recognize that Elisha is a man of God. This is another Old Testament way of saying that he is a prophet. So she provides for him meals, but then she realizes that that's not enough. She goes, let me build an extra room for him to be able to stay in. This is hospitality to the max, right? We think as Southern people, we have the corner on hospitality because we will make sure our house is clean and we'll cook a meal for people. Rarely have I seen, maybe never have I seen someone be like, no, we're going to build a house in case people want to stay the night. But this is what she does, this massive role of generosity towards Elijah. And so from this woman, we see lifted up this importance of regular obedience to God. That this is something that she does on the regular for this man of God. And so if we take what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks and we put this together, while we are trustingly being obedient to Jesus, and we're listening to his Spirit about the big things that he may be calling us towards, in which we're going to have to be fully dependent upon him, our lives in the meantime are to be filled with daily acts of obedience. Daily acts of obedience. So we're not just waiting for those big things that Lindsay talked about last week and just be like, well, we'll just wait here until he answers it and then we'll do something. No, it's filled with daily acts of obedience, just like we see within this woman here. She takes her financial gifts that the Lord has been given her and she uses it to advance his kingdom. Now, we see this principle even lifted up in the New Testament as well. Paul, in his first letter that he's writing to his mentee, Timothy, who's also a pastor in the town of Ephesus, he's writing to him and he says, Timothy, as you begin to teach your congregation, be sure you tell those who are well off in that congregation financially that they are to give generously to others. And so in the Old Testament, we see this lifted up. In the New Testament, we see this lifted up. And so we can hear that and we would think, yeah, that's right. Those who are wealthy do need to share it with those who are in need. Because then what happens is we go, but we are not wealthy. Let me go ahead and dismiss myself from this equation because, Lord, I am not wealthy. Have you seen the car that I drive? Or have you seen how the struggle it is to be able to pay this bill or that bill or the worry that I have? So we can dismiss ourselves. But as I was thinking about it this week, it humbled me to look up some stats on global wealth, specifically from Pew's research. Pew Research said that those who are considered poor by American standards, if you were to take that same number, import it into the global economy, we would be considered middle class because we would live on more than $10 a day. That means to be middle class, according to the global perspective, you would have to make $50 a week. I would be willing to bet that 99% of us in this room make more than $50 a week. So that means that by global standards, you and I are not only middle class, we may be even upper middle class. So before I look at this and I'm going, yes, people that are wealthy should be generous, the Lord tapped me on my head and be like, yeah, sounds good, doesn't it? Yes. That it is up to those who are wealthy to be able to give financially to others. Now, when we begin to think about this, we realize that we have more money than what we realize. So then the question becomes, how do we leverage what the Lord has given us to be able to further his kingdom within the world? And that comes through a variety of things. That could come through maybe you sponsor a child through Compassion or World Vision or something like that. It could come through supporting missionaries that are going to Cambodia or in Poland that you and I, we may never be able to share the gospel with those, but we can financially support those who do. It may be the reason why we give to communion offerings every single month, and we ask you guys to participate in that because there's a way to multiply our collective voice together, our collective finances together. I may be able only to give $35 a month for someone, but if collectively in this room all of us give $35 a month, well, that is a large pot of money that the Lord can use to do kingdom work. It's why we ask to give towards the church. Is because collectively there are things that we can do as the body of Christ that individually we can't accomplish. And so for us, it's a call to look at our own personal finances, to put it in perspective and go, how do I leverage this to be able to advance the kingdom of God within the world? But let's just set finances to the side for a moment and just think about that following after Jesus and the daily decisions that we make and being obedient to him are not only just privy to finances. It's easy to lift up within this text because this is what we see this woman doing. But then there are other areas of our lives and daily obedience to Jesus that we need to make sure that we are doing. So if you are in high school, it could look like, or middle school, it could look like speaking up for the person that constantly gets picked on because they're different or quote unquote poor. And the reason I say quote unquote poor is based on what we just talked about with the global economy. But we would look and say, I remember some things change over time, but I remember growing up in high school and I can have pictures of people that fit that category. You in high school, middle school, you could probably do the exact same thing. It's speaking up for people and letting them know they have worth. That's daily obedience to Jesus in that moment. Or it could be a daily obedience for us as parents is having as many conversations with our kids about what Jesus is doing in their heart as we do about their grades or their sports performance. It's following those nudges in our lives and making sure that we're following them. See, following Jesus is not just saying yes in the big things. It is saying yes to the 1,001 little nudges that the Spirit impresses upon you every single day. And so, yes, there's finances, but there's also other ways that we say yes to Jesus. Now, if we go back to the financial picture here for a moment, you have this woman who has somehow avoided one of the greatest traps that money can pull us into, in the fact that we always need more. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? I can look at my friends and my neighbors and be like, I would be content if I made what they made. And then our friends and neighbors are looking at their friends and neighbors and saying, I would only be content if I made what they made. And so there's this trap that we fall into with money that it's never enough. We could always have more, and therefore we always seek after more. But somehow this woman has been able to avoid that. And the way we know that is by her what she says in verse 13, when she says, I dwell among my own people. So Elisha and Gehazi ask her, like, what can we do for you? And her response is, I dwell among my own people. This is her way of saying, I don't need anything from the king. I don't need to be considered a higher class. My people are my people, and I'm content to be with them. I'm content with where I am. She has learned to be content with what the Lord has provided. And learning to be content is the springboard for our generosity. It starts with this foundation of being content with what we have. She is content with what she has so she can freely give what she doesn't need. Now, I don't know about you, but when was the last time you felt content? And if you are like me, you may struggle to name that moment where you were content with what you have. So some of us, and I am included in the us here, very much so, some of us need to stop spending to be able to be content. Some of us need to stop scrolling and searching to be content. Some of us just need to simply say, the moment we see something that we desire, to say to ourselves, I have everything that I need. It could be the reason we struggle with the idea of being generous is because we're not learning how to be content. We learn to be content, then we can learn to begin to be generous. So this woman has evidently picked up on this, but this isn't the end of her story. So let's look in verses 14 through 17. After she has this conversation with these two gentlemen, Elijah looks at Gehazi and he says, what then is to be done for her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son and her husband is old. Elisha said, call her. And when he called her, she stood in the doorway. And he said, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my Lord. O man of God, do not lie to your servant. But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about the same time the following spring, as Elisha has said to her. So when she says, I'm content, Elisha and Gehazi have this conversation and go, what can we do? And Gehazi realizes that she is without a son and her husband is getting older. Now, this is where it gets so crazy to me. For in that situation, I'd be like, yeah, that is true. I don't know what we're going to do about that situation. What does Elisha do? He goes, oh, I've heard of this story before. Abraham and Sarah reminds me of this story. Bring her in here. And he says, as the man of God, let me promise to her a son. You want to talk about bold faith in the Lord? To look at her and to say, about this time next year, you are going to have a son. And when he pronounces this over her, you realize that this is something that she has wrestled with the Lord with for a very long time. Because look at her response. She looks at him and says, oh, no, my Lord. Oh, man of God, do not lie to your servant. What she's saying is going, my heart can't take if this isn't true. Don't dangle this before me if you can't promise that this is going to come to fruition. That is too deep of a wound for me to step into and trust in this very moment. So you know that this is something that she has wrestled with for years with the Lord, of the situation that she finds herself in. But what I want you to notice is that she does not allow the Lord's no to her heart's deepest desire to keep her from being faithful to him. She does not allow that no of her deepest desire to keep her from being faithful to God. There are years that she is pleading with him for a son, and it seems to her as though he is silent, that he is absent from the situation, that he is ignoring what's going on, and she is constantly going to him about this. Yet in the midst of that, she is still faithful. In God's silence, she is still trustingly being obedient in all of the small things. So she is pleading with him, but she knows Elisha is going to need sustenance, so she provides that for him. Knows he's going to need a place to be able to rest, so she provides that for him. Even though walking through the deep wounds of knowing that one of her deepest heart's desires has not been answered yet. Church, there are those of you in this room that you have laid your deepest desires for the Lord, before the Lord for years, and yet he seems silent in his reply. He seems absent from your situation. He seems like he could care less about your situation, but it does not mean, his silence does not mean that God does not care or that he's absent from your situation. It simply means that he's displaying his wisdom in a way that we can't understand. He's displaying his wisdom over our lives in a way that we cannot possibly fathom. And in that season, in that time of our lives, the call upon us to be faithful in the little things that he puts before us. So for this woman, the Lord in his wisdom provides this miraculous child for her. So the Lord's silence ends, and then she finds herself with a son, but this is not the end of the story by a long shot. So starting in verse 18, this is what we read. It says, when the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. And he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." And the father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when he had lifted him up and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. And then she called to her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys that I may go quickly to the man of God and come back again." And he said, "Why would you go to him today? Is it neither new moon? It's neither new moon or Sabbath." And she said, "All is well." Now this whole exchange, if we pause for a moment, is very strange. Because you have the situation, the son dies, she goes and places him, she goes to her husband and says, "I need the donkey, we got to go, I got to go to the man of God." And he says, "Well, why are you going now?" Which is, to us, it kind of leads to a multiple situation. Does he know that his son has passed away? We don't know. Is he callous towards this situation? He has no faith? We don't know. But what we do know is that she evidently travels to Elisha on a very common thing. It's not new moon or Sabbath. So his question is, "Why are you going today?" And her response is also interesting, where she says, "All is well." As I read this story for the first time, I was like, all is not well. How are you saying all is well? And then come to find out, this is the Hebrew word for peace, shalom, that we've heard before. And what she is saying at that moment is she's going, if you will just let me go, everything's going to be fine. If you just let me go, everything's going to be fine. And so that is enough to satisfy whatever questions that he has. And so we continue on in this story here. So he's starting in verse 4. And then she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. And when the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with your child?' And she answered, again, 'All is well.'" Why? Because she's looking at Gehazi and going, "I don't have time for you, sir. I need to get to the man of God. This is the one that I've got to talk to." And then 27, and when she came to the mountain of the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. Gehazi came to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" He said to Gehazi, "Tie up your garment." and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet them. If anyone greets you, do not reply, and lay my staff on the face of the child." And then the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. So we see the importance of the urgency that Elisha has in this moment, because he looks at Gehazi and says, "Tie up your robe," meaning that you can run freely, that your feet aren't going to get caught up in it, "and take my staff, because that is an assurance that I'm going to come." This woman looks at Elisha and says, "I'm not leaving your side. I will be with you as we travel on this way." And so let's continue on. Verse 31. Gehazi went on and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. And therefore he returned to meet him and told Elisha, "The child has not awakened." And when Elisha came into the house, he saw the child laying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. And then he went up and he lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands, and he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. And then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house, and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground, and then she picked up her son and went out. Now, you want to talk about a roller coaster of emotions when you read this story. You go from a moment where you celebrate the fact that the Lord has provided this child for her, and then all of a sudden she goes to this tragic losing of her son, only to be able to miraculously hold her son again. Now, what I want us to do this morning is I want it to look at this account that takes place, and I want this to be a picture of our entire lives. So we've been on this trusting obedience of following after Jesus in our daily life, following those 101 nudges that the Spirit gives us. And on this journey with Jesus, we know that He's giving us dreams that we have to completely be dependent upon Him with. But that also means the story lifts up that it does not always go according to our plans. The path of following after Jesus is not always easy. This woman loses her son, and it sends her into desperation. And in her desperation, she clings to the feet of Elisha. Now, that may not seem like a big deal in the moment, but if we look back in the story, when he pronounces over her that she is going to have a son, he does not speak to her directly. She stands in the doorway. He speaks to Gehazi. Gehazi turns around and tells her what Elisha has said about her. This shows that she has the utmost respect and reverence for who Elisha is. She goes, "This is a man of God. I cannot approach him just as I would anybody else, so I've got to make sure I take proper social measures." But yet, in the moment of desperation, what happens? All of those social measures go out the window. In her desperation, what does she do? She grabs the feet of Elisha. Gehazi freaks out and tries to move her away, going, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "I will not let go of this man's feet. I will be here until he hears what I have to say." Church, in our moments of desperation, you are called to cling to the one that is giving you his word. In your moments of desperation, you cling to the one who has given you his word. That there have all been moments in our lives, and if there haven't been moments in our lives, unfortunately there will be moments in our lives in which our desperation drives us to cling to the feet of Jesus. And what Scripture shows us is that what is good for us in those moments of desperation is not necessarily God's answer, but his presence. What is good for us in those moments of desperation is not necessarily his answer, but his presence. That is what our souls really need in those moments. In this situation, this mom gets her heart's desires, but we know that that isn't always the case. So what do we do when we don't get the answers to our deepest desires, we cling to the feet of Jesus, understanding that his nearness is for our good. That the wounds of our hearts that come about when our deepest desires are not met can only be healed by the love of our God. Not necessarily from the answer that we want, but from his presence. Made me think of when you have a young child that gets hurt. They fall down, scrape their knee, they come inside, and then all of a sudden you have the powers of a magician in your hand in the form of a box of Band-Aids. And you place that Band-Aids on a child's knee, and all of a sudden they don't hurt anymore. Or if you played sports growing up, and all of a sudden you would severely hurt yourself, your coach would say, like, put ice on it. Because somehow ice would just make it all go away. Legs completely broken, ice on it, magically just stops. In the same way, we have what the salve that our deepest wounds need, and they need to be filled up with, is the loving presence of God. That in those moments of our deepest desperation and our deepest wounds, what we need is our lives to be filled with the presence of our loving God. And if you want to see the love of God that he has towards you, we see it foreshadowed in what Elisha does in this moment. He foreshadows the love of God. So if you have this image in your head, you have this child laying down. He's evidently laying on his back. Elisha lays on top of him, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, and he stretches himself out on this child to bring life back into this child. Now take this image of Elisha being spread out, stretched out, and then transport your mind to the cross. That God, in what he does in Christ, breathes life and hope into us to resurrect us to be the child of God that he's created us to be. We see the deep love of the Lord in which he stretches out his hands and says, let me pay the sacrifice so that you can see the love that I have for you. And let it be a reminder to you of the 3 days of silence after my death, when you think that I am dead, when you think that I have no longer any strength, when you think that I am silent or ignorant of what's going on, or I don't have the power. In the midst of that, I want you to cling to me, because 3 days later, you're going to see my resurrection. You're going to see my power. One day, church, you will stand before the face of God and you will see the resurrection power. You will see the wisdom of God on display before you. And the deepest wounds that we have had in this life will be filled by the very good presence of God. And so we cling to that in difficult times. That while we're on this path to flourishing, we know that it leads to flourishing when we chase after Jesus, but we also know that life doesn't go the way we want it to go. So when we're tempted to look to other things, this is a call within this passage to look back to the one that's on the path with you.